In the modern world, psychology is a science. We talk about neurons, neurotransmitters, trauma, genetics, and environment. We understand that thoughts, emotions, and behavior are shaped by the brain and by life experience. But in the medieval world, none of this existed. There was no psychology as a discipline, no therapists, no mental health vocabulary. Instead, the human mind was explained through religion, superstition, ancient philosophy, and fear. To understand medieval psychology myths, we must first step into a time when the mind was not a medical mystery, but a spiritual battlefield. During the Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, people did not separate the mind from the soul. Thoughts were not seen as brain activity. Emotions were not chemical reactions. Everything mental was deeply moral and spiritual. If someone behaved strangely, felt overwhelming sadness, heard voices, or acted violently, the cause was rarely questioned in biological terms. Instead, people asked, did this person commit? What demon entered them? What imbalance in nature has occurred? The foundation of medieval thinking came from a mix of Christian theology and ancient Greek philosophy. Thinkers like Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Galen were treated almost like unquestionable authorities. Their ideas survived not because they were scientifically tested, but because they were written down, preserved, and repeated by scholars and clergy. Medieval universities taught these ideas as absolute truth. Questioning them was often seen as heresy. One of the most important beliefs was that the soul governed the mind. The soul was considered eternal, divine, and far more important than the physical body. The brain itself was poorly understood. Dissections were rare and often forbidden. As a result, medieval scholars imagined the brain as a set of chambers filled with invisible forces. Memory, imagination, reason, and emotion were thought to live in separate physical spaces inside the head, almost like rooms in a house. This idea felt logical at the time, even though it had no real evidence. Because the soul was central, mental suffering was often interpreted as spiritual failure. Sadness could mean a lack of faith. Anxiety could mean temptation by the devil. Anger might signal pride or moral weakness. There was little room for empathy. Instead of asking how to help a suffering person, society focused on correcting them, through prayer, punishment, or public shame. Religion dominated every aspect of life, and psychology was no exception. Medieval Christianity taught that the world was a test. Pain had meaning. Suffering purified the soul. This belief had devastating consequences for people experiencing mental illness. If your pain had a purpose, then curing it too easily could interfere with God's plan. This idea justified neglect and cruelty, all in the name of spiritual growth. At the same time, superstition filled the gaps left by ignorance. People feared invisible forces everywhere. Demons were believed to whisper thoughts into the mind. Evil spirits caused nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and uncontrollable urges. Even ordinary mood changes were sometimes blamed on supernatural influence. A person who laughed too much, cried too often, or acted differently from social norms could be labeled dangerous. Medical knowledge existed, but it was primitive and symbolic. Doctors did not observe patterns or run experiments. Instead, they relied on ancient texts and symbolic reasoning. The body was seen as a reflection of the universe. Just as the cosmos had balance, so did the human being. If someone's behavior was off, it meant something inside them, or around them, was out of balance. This way of thinking created a world where mental health was never neutral. There was no concept of having depression, or living with anxiety. You were either morally weak, spiritually attacked, or physically corrupted. Labels were absolute. Once given, they were hard to escape. Social class also shaped medieval psychology. Nobles were often excused for strange behavior, while peasants were punished. A king experiencing paranoia might be seen as divinely chosen or burdened by God. A poor person showing the same symptoms could be beaten, imprisoned, or exorcised. Psychology was not just wrong, it was deeply unfair. Children were another casualty of this mindset. Medieval society believed children were born sinful and irrational. Emotional distress in children was rarely acknowledged. Fear, sadness, or trauma were interpreted as disobedience. This harsh view would echo for centuries, delaying any serious understanding of child psychology. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval thinking was certainty. People believed they understood the mind completely. There was no curiosity, no humility, no concept of, we might be wrong. This confidence allowed myths to harden into doctrine. Once an idea entered religious teaching or medical texts, it became law. And yet, these beliefs did not come from stupidity. Medieval people were trying to make sense of a complex world with the tools they had. They observed patterns, told stories, and searched for meaning. But without scientific method, their explanations drifted into fantasy. Psychology became a mixture of poetry, fear, and moral judgment. Understanding this world is essential, because many of these myths did not disappear overnight. Some survived into the Renaissance. Others quietly shaped modern attitudes toward mental illness, stigma, shame, and misunderstanding that still exist today. This chapter sets the stage for everything that follows. Before we explore humors, demons, hysteria, and madness, we must remember one truth. Medieval psychology was not about healing the mind. It was about controlling behavior, protecting belief systems, and explaining the unexplainable. The human mind was not studied, it was judged. And in that judgment, countless people suffered in silence, convinced that their thoughts were not symptoms, but sins. If there was one psychological theory that dominated medieval thinking more than any other, it was the theory of the four humors. For centuries, this idea explained not only illness, but personality, intelligence, emotions, morality, and even destiny. Medieval people genuinely believed that the human mind was controlled by four bodily fluids, and that a single imbalance could turn a calm person violent, a joyful soul depressed, or a rational thinker insane. The theory did not originate in the Middle Ages. It came from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, whose writings survived the fall of Rome, and were preserved by monks and scholars. By medieval times, these ideas had become unquestionable truth. They were taught in universities, practiced by doctors, and accepted by the church. To doubt the humors was to doubt science itself, at least what passed for science at the time. According to this theory, the human body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with a specific temperament, emotion, season, element, and even moral quality. Health, both physical and mental, depended entirely on keeping these humors in perfect balance. Blood was associated with air and spring. A person dominated by blood was called sanguine. They were believed to be cheerful, optimistic, social, and confident. Too much blood, however, made someone reckless, lustful, and emotionally unstable. Excessive happiness was not always seen as healthy, it could be a sign of dangerous imbalance. Phlegm was linked to water and winter. A phlegmatic person was calm, slow, quiet, and unemotional. While moderation was praised, too much phlegm supposedly made a person lazy, dull, forgetful, and mentally slow. Someone who lacked motivation or showed little emotional reaction might be labeled phlegmatic, and therefore intellectually inferior. Yellow bile was connected to fire and summer. This humor governed anger, ambition, and intensity. A choleric personality was strong, decisive, and commanding, but also aggressive, impatient, and cruel when unbalanced. Many medieval leaders were described this way, and their violent behavior was often excused as natural temperament rather than moral failure. Black bile was the most feared humor of all. Linked to earth and autumn, it was believed to cause melancholy. A melancholic person was sad, withdrawn, thoughtful, and prone to despair. Too much black bile was thought to poison the mind, leading to depression, madness, hallucinations, and even suicidal thoughts. This humor would shape medieval views of mental illness more than any other. What made the four humors theory especially dangerous was how completely it explained everything. Personality differences were not psychological, they were chemical. Emotional pain was not a response to trauma, it was a bodily defect. If someone behaved strangely, the solution was not understanding or compassion. It was physical correction. Medieval doctors believed that humors could be adjusted through diet, environment, bloodletting, purging, and enemas. Sad. You might be bled to remove excess black bile. Angry. Given cold foods to reduce yellow bile. Anxious. Forced to vomit or fast. These treatments were brutal, painful, and often deadly, but they were considered logical. Bloodletting became especially common. Doctors believed that removing blood could restore balance and calm the mind. People suffering from sadness, fear, insomnia, or confusion were frequently cut with blades or leeches. If the patient survived, the treatment was praised. If they died, it was blamed on fate or God's will. The theory also reinforced social stereotypes. Certain professions were believed to attract certain humors. Scholars and artists were thought to be melancholic. Soldiers were choleric. Farmers were phlegmatic. Nobles were often described as sanguine. These labels justified class divisions and discrimination. Your place in society was not just social, it was biological. Even emotions like love, jealousy, courage, and fear were reduced to fluids. Love sickness, a condition widely believed in medieval times, was thought to be caused by overheating of the blood, or an imbalance of humors triggered by desire. Instead of emotional counseling, patients were given cold baths, purges, or isolation. Religion adapted the humors to fit its worldview. While the theory was physical, its consequences were moral. A person who failed to control their temperament was seen as weak or sinful. Self-control meant keeping your humors in check. Emotional restraint became a virtue, while emotional expression became suspicious. Women were judged especially harshly under this system. Medieval thinkers believed women were naturally colder and wetter, dominated by phlegm. This supposedly made them more emotional, irrational, and mentally unstable. Any sign of sadness, anger, or anxiety in women was often blamed on their biology rather than circumstances. The four humors also influenced how mental illness was defined. There was no concept of anxiety disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. Everything was collapsed into imbalance. This erased individuality. Two people with completely different experiences could receive the same treatment and suffer the same harm. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the humors theory was its resistance to evidence. If a treatment failed, the answer was never, "The theory is wrong." The answer was, "The imbalance was stronger than we thought." This circular logic allowed the myth to survive for over 1,000 years. And yet, the idea felt comforting. It offered simple explanations for complex emotions. It promised control in a chaotic world. If suffering had a cause, it could have a cure, even if that cure was imaginary. The legacy of the four humors is still with us. Words like sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic are still used today. More importantly, the belief that mental suffering must have a simple physical cause still shapes how people think about psychology. This chapter reveals a painful truth: medieval psychology did not ask how people felt. It asked what was wrong inside them. And for centuries the answer was always the same. Your fluids are to blame. For medieval people, the human mind was not shaped by childhood experience, trauma, or thought patterns. Instead, it was controlled by something far more tangible, or so they believed. According to medieval medicine and psychology, every thought, emotion, and personality trait came from four bodily fluids known as the four humors. This theory became the backbone of how medieval society understood mental health, behavior, intelligence, and even morality. For centuries it was accepted not as a guess, but as unquestionable truth. The four humors theory originated in ancient Greece, primarily through the works of Hippocrates and later Galen. Their writings survived into the Middle Ages, and were treated almost like sacred texts. Medieval scholars believed that ancient thinkers had already discovered the secrets of the human body and mind. Their job was not to question these ideas, but to preserve and apply them. As a result, the four humors became the closest thing the Go society had to psychology. According to this theory, the body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to a personality type, emotional pattern, element of nature, season, and even moral tendency. Mental health meant balance. Mental illness meant excess. There was no room for complexity. Everything about a person could be explained by which fluid dominated their body. Blood was associated with air and the season of spring. People dominated by blood were called sanguine. They were believed to be joyful, friendly, energetic, and emotionally expressive. At first glance, this seemed positive. But medieval thinkers believed that too much blood made a person impulsive, irresponsible, overly sexual, and mentally unstable. Excessive happiness was suspicious. Emotional intensity was not admired, it was feared. Phlegm was linked to water and winter. A phlegmatic person was calm, quiet, slow-moving, and emotionally reserved. This temperament was sometimes praised for its steadiness, but it was also associated with laziness, lack of intelligence, weak memory, and emotional dullness. Someone who appeared unmotivated or introverted might be labeled phlegmatic, and therefore mentally inferior. Yellow bile was connected to fire and summer. Those ruled by yellow bile were known as choleric. They were ambitious, decisive, confident, and natural leaders. However, imbalance made them aggressive, angry, violent, and cruel. Rage was not seen as a psychological response, it was a chemical overflow. This belief often excused abusive behavior, especially in powerful men, by framing it as natural temperament. The most feared humor of all was black bile. Associated with earth and autumn, black bile was believed to cause melancholy. Melancholic individuals were thought to be sad, withdrawn, fearful, and deeply reflective. Excess black bile supposedly poisoned the mind, leading to depression, madness, hallucinations, obsessive thoughts, and despair. Many symptoms we now associate with serious mental illness were blamed entirely on this mysterious fluid. What made the four humors theory so influential, and so dangerous, was how completely it explained human behavior. Emotions were not reactions to life events. Personality was not shaped by experience. Trauma did not exist as a concept. If someone suffered emotionally, it was because their body was broken. The mind was simply a passive victim of fluid imbalance. Treatment followed this logic. Medieval doctors believed they could fix the mind by physically manipulating the body. The most common method was bloodletting. If someone appeared sad, anxious, confused, or restless, doctors often assumed excess black bile or blood. The solution was to drain blood using knives, lancets, or leeches. Patients could lose massive amounts of blood in the name of mental clarity. Other treatments included forced vomiting, purging through laxatives, enemas, fasting, and extreme diets. Hot emotions were treated with cold foods. Cold personalities were treated with heat. None of these methods were tested or measured. Success was based on belief, not results. If a patient improved, the theory was praised. If they worsened and died, it was blamed on fate or God's will. The four humors also shaped how medieval society judged people. Personality was destiny. If you were melancholic, you were naturally prone to sadness. If you were choleric, violence was expected. These labels followed people for life. There was no understanding that behavior could change, heal, or evolve. Social class played a major role as well. Nobles were often described as sanguine or choleric, energetic and commanding. Peasants were labeled phlegmatic, slow and dull. Scholars and artists were thought to be melancholic, which oddly gave sadness a strange prestige among intellectuals. This system justified inequality by turning prejudice into biology. Women suffered especially under humoral psychology. Medieval thinkers believed women were naturally colder and wetter, dominated by phlegm. This supposedly made them emotional, irrational, forgetful, and mentally unstable. Female sadness, anger, or anxiety was rarely taken seriously. Instead, it was dismissed as natural weakness. These beliefs laid the foundation for centuries of medical misogyny. Religion blended easily with humoral theory. Emotional self-control became a moral duty. To manage your humors was to manage your soul. Strong emotions were signs of imbalance, and imbalance was a failure of discipline. Mental suffering became something to correct, not understand. Perhaps the most disturbing feature of the four humors theory was its immunity to doubt. No matter how badly treatments failed, the theory itself was never questioned. Medieval psychology operated in a closed system. Imbalance explained everything, and everything confirmed imbalance. This circular logic allowed the myth to survive for more than 1,000 years. Even today its influence lingers. Words like melancholic, choleric, phlegmatic, and sanguine are still part of modern language. More importantly, the idea that mental suffering must be fixed, rather than understood, echoes medieval thinking. The four humors were not just a medical theory. They were a worldview, one that reduced the human mind to fluids, erased emotional complexity, and caused immense suffering. Medieval people truly believed these ideas. And because they believed them, millions were blood purged, and punished in the name of mental balance. In medieval psychology, no mental state was more feared, misunderstood, and strangely admired than melancholy. Unlike rage or madness, which was seen as dangerous and sinful, melancholy occupied a strange middle ground. It was associated with sadness, withdrawal, fear, and despair, but also with intelligence, creativity, and deep thought. Medieval society truly believed that suffering made a person wiser, and that a troubled mind could be a sign of greatness rather than illness. This belief came directly from the theory of the four humors, where melancholy was caused by an excess of black bile. Black bile was thought to be cold, dry, and heavy, pulling the mind inward. A melancholic person was quiet, reflective, serious, and prone to long periods of sadness. But instead of treating this as a condition to heal, medieval thinkers often treated it as a natural temperament, or even a divine burden. Ancient philosophers played a major role in shaping this idea. Aristotle famously suggested that many great thinkers, poets, and leaders were melancholic. His words echoed through medieval scholarship. If sadness accompanied brilliance, then melancholy was not merely weakness, it was the price of intellect. This belief would shape how depression was viewed for centuries. Medieval scholars believed the melancholic mind was deeper than others. While cheerful people were distracted by pleasure, melancholics were believed to see truth. They contemplated death, God, and the nature of existence. In monasteries and universities, this inward focus was sometimes praised. A monk who withdrew from joy and laughter was seen as spiritually advanced, not mentally unwell. But this admiration came with a dark side. While mild melancholy was romanticized, severe melancholy was terrifying. Excess black bile was believed to rot the mind. It could cause irrational fear, paranoia, hallucinations, obsession, and despair. People suffering from what we now recognize as major depression, anxiety disorders, or psychosis were labeled melancholic, and often treated harshly. Medieval doctors believed black bile physically poisoned the brain. The mind did not break from emotional pain or trauma, but from internal corruption. As a result, treatment focused on removing or balancing black bile, malunderstanding the person's suffering. Compassion was secondary to correction. Common treatments for melancholy included bloodletting, purging, fasting, strict diets, and isolation. Doctors believed dark foods, cold environments, and solitude increased black bile. Ironically, melancholic individuals, already withdrawn and hopeless, were often isolated further, worsening their condition. Religion intensified the problem. Christianity taught that sadness could be spiritually dangerous. Acedia, often translated as spiritual sloth or despair, was considered a sin. Persistent sadness suggested a lack of faith, gratitude, or trust in God. This meant melancholic individuals were not just sick, they were morally suspect. At the same time, suffering was glorified. Saints were praised for enduring despair and temptation. Tears were seen as purification. Emotional pain was reframed as spiritual testing. This contradiction meant that melancholic people were both admired and condemned, praised for depth, punished for weakness. This created a cruel psychological trap. If someone felt deep sadness, they were encouraged to endure it silently. Seeking relief could be seen as spiritual failure. Healing threatened meaning. Pain became identity. Artists and scholars were especially affected. Medieval poets, philosophers, and theologians often described melancholy as a companion to genius. To think deeply was to suffer deeply. Creativity was believed to flow from sadness, not joy. This idea discouraged treatment and reinforced the myth that emotional pain was necessary for greatness. Social class also mattered. A noble suffering from melancholy might be described as thoughtful or burdened by responsibility. A peasant with the same symptoms could be labeled mad, possessed, or useless. The same emotional state carried different meanings depending on who experienced it. Women faced even harsher judgment. Female melancholy was rarely romanticized. Instead, it was blamed on weak bodies, sinful thoughts, or moral instability. A sad woman was not a thinker, she was a problem. Her suffering was dismissed, punished, or medicalized without empathy. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of medieval melancholy was how it erased causes. Grief, trauma, loss, abuse, poverty. None of these were recognized as reasons for sadness. A person grieving the death of a child could be diagnosed as melancholic rather than supported. Emotional responses to real pain were pathologized as bodily failure. Fear played a huge role as well. Medieval people believed extreme melancholy could lead to madness, suicide, or possession. Someone who spoke of hopelessness or death might be watched, restrained, or exorcised. Instead of receiving care, they were treated as threats to themselves, to others, and to God's order. Yet despite all this, melancholy endured as a powerful cultural myth. It explained sadness without requiring understanding. It gave meaning to suffering in a world full of hardship. And it allowed society to avoid responsibility for mental pain by blaming invisible fluids. The legacy of medieval melancholy is still with us. Even today, people romanticize suffering. Depression is sometimes to creativity. Pain is framed as depth. And many still believe that strong minds must endure emotional darkness alone. Chapter 3 reveals a tragic truth. Medieval psychology did not ask how to relieve suffering. It asked how to interpret it. Melancholy was not healed. It was endured, admired, feared, and misunderstood. And in that misunderstanding, countless people lived and died, believing their pain was not an illness but their destiny. In the medieval worldview, the mind was never neutral. Every thought, feeling, and behavior was deeply entwined with morality, spirituality, and cosmic order. Within this framework, madness, what we might now call severe mental illness, was rarely considered a medical condition. Instead, it was almost always seen as divine punishment. People believed that God, angels, or cosmic forces intervened directly in the human psyche to reward virtue or punish sin. And that mental suffering was often the result of moral failure or spiritual corruption. Madness in the Middle Ages encompassed a wide spectrum of behavior. People who shouted, wandered, cried incessantly, or refused to conform to social norms could all be labeled mad. Hallucinations, delusions, and violent outbursts were seen not as neurological or psychological conditions, but as a person had fallen out of divine favor. Unlike today, when mental illness is approached through science, medieval society interpreted every behavior as a moral or spiritual sign. The roots of this belief were deeply religious. Christianity dominated Europe, and moral order was intertwined with physical and mental health. The Church taught that sin had consequences, both visible and invisible. For example, if a person engaged in deceit, theft, or blasphemy, God's punishment could manifest as suffering in the body or mind. Madness, in this system, was not random, it was purposeful. It was a lesson, a warning, or a correction designed to bring a soul back to righteousness. This divine interpretation of mental illness shaped treatment, and often worsened suffering. Religious authorities, rather than physicians, were often called upon to cure the mad. Treatments focused on spiritual correction rather than physical or psychological care. Exorcism, prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage were common. A person who heard voices might be forced to confess sins, endure long vigils, or participate in ritual purification. While some of these practices offered comfort through community and ritual, many were harsh, frightening, and even abusive. The stigma surrounding madness was intense. Unlike physical injuries, which could evoke sympathy, mental illness was assumed to reflect personal failure. Families often hid affected members, fearing shame, social isolation, or divine wrath. Communities, too, viewed the mad with suspicion and fear. Public spaces were dangerous for people with severe mental symptoms, who might be mocked, chained, or cast out. The line between punishment and protection was blurred. Medieval legal systems also reflected this perspective. If a mad person committed a crime, their actions were sometimes interpreted as the result of God's testing. But more often they were punished harshly. Madness could be both excuse and condemnation, depending on social status, the nature of the act, and prevailing beliefs about divine justice. Nobles might be forgiven for erratic behavior as a sign of divine favor or burden, while peasants might be beaten, imprisoned, or exorcised. Interestingly, not all madness was viewed negatively. Certain forms of eccentric behavior, especially in scholars, prophets, or holy men, could be interpreted as divine inspiration. Visions, voices, and extreme withdrawal were sometimes seen as gifts rather than curses. The difference was moral framing. If the behavior aligned with religious purpose or apparent wisdom, it could be admired. If it deviated from moral and social norms, it was feared. The theory of the four humors also intersected with divine punishment. Excess black bile might cause melancholy, but extreme imbalance could be interpreted as God's wrath. Violent outbursts linked to yellow bile could be framed as divine anger manifesting through the body. By merging physiological ideas with spiritual interpretations, medieval society created a system in which all mental distress had meaning, and meaning was tied to morality. Madness also had a social function. By framing mental illness as divine punishment, medieval society reinforced obedience, conformity, and fear of sin. If everyone believed that misbehavior could lead to madness, or that madness was the result of moral failure, then social control was maintained. The mind became a site of regulation as much as suffering. People internalized these beliefs, often blaming themselves for symptoms they could not control. Women, once again, faced particular vulnerability. Female madness was frequently interpreted as a sign of moral weakness, sexual impropriety, or demonic influence. Men might be labeled choleric or melancholy. Women were often accused of hysteria, witchcraft, or possession. Treatments for women were especially harsh, ranging from confinement and physical restraint to ritual exorcisms. The moral lens through which their minds were judged amplified both stigma and suffering. Despite these grim realities, the belief in divine punishment also reflected medieval attempts to make sense of human behavior in a chaotic world. Epidemics, famine, political turmoil, and personal loss created immense stress and suffering. Without medical knowledge or scientific method, mental illness was terrifying and inexplicable. Interpreting it as divine judgment offered a form of explanation, and, paradoxically, hope. If madness was punishment, then it could be redeemed through repentance, prayer, or moral correction. The legacy of this worldview persisted for centuries. Even after the Renaissance and the beginnings of medical psychology, mental illness was often framed in moral or spiritual terms. Stigma, fear, and punitive treatment remained deeply ingrained. By understanding how madness was once seen as divine punishment, we can see how cultural interpretations of mental suffering, have profound effects on care, compassion, and understanding. Chapter 4 highlights a critical truth about medieval psychology: the mind was never astral, and suffering was never accidental. Every symptom, every odd behavior, every emotional disturbance was interpreted as a message from the divine, carrying meaning, warning, or moral judgment. For those experiencing true mental illness, this worldview could be devastating, offering not understanding or help, but fear, shame, and isolation. And yet, within this harsh system, people also sought meaning, connection, and redemption. Madness was terrifying, but it was also, paradoxically, a lens through which medieval society tried to understand the human condition, a reflection of their deepest fears, values, and beliefs about morality, the soul, and the divine. In the medieval world, the human mind was a mysterious and dangerous place. Without scientific understanding, without anatomy, without any formal psychology, people sought explanations for mental distress in the supernatural. One of the most pervasive beliefs of the Middle Ages was that demons, spirits, and evil forces could invade the mind, causing madness, despair, or strange behavior. For centuries, this idea dominated how society understood psychological suffering, often overshadowing physical or rational explanations entirely. The concept of demonic possession was intertwined with religion, superstition, and morality. The Church taught that demons were fallen angels, intelligent and malicious, constantly seeking to corrupt humans. While heaven guided the righteous, demons tempted the weak, exploiting vulnerabilities of the body and soul. Strange thoughts, sudden outbursts, irrational fears, or uncontrollable behaviors were interpreted not as symptoms of illness, but as the deliberate interference of these supernatural forces. Mental illness, in this framework, was rarely viewed as natural. A person hearing voices, seeing visions, or exhibiting erratic behavior was often assumed to be possessed by demons. Anxiety, depression, paranoia, or mania could all be explained as spiritual invasion. Even ordinary behavior, anger, lust, curiosity, could be exaggerated into signs of demonic influence if it deviated from societal or religious norms. The treatment of such possessed individuals focused almost exclusively on the spiritual realm. Exorcisms, prayers, holy water, fasting, and confessions were common methods used to expel the intruding spirits. Priests and monks were often called in, armed with religious rituals rather than medical tools. Exorcisms could be terrifying: loud chants, physical restraint, and public rituals were intended to force the demon out. For the medieval mind, success validated the idea of possession. Failure was seen as proof of the demon's strength, the individual's sinfulness, or God's mysterious plan. This belief system blurred the line between morality and mental health. A person who displayed unusual or unacceptable behavior was assumed to be morally flawed, spiritually weak, or cursed. Madness became a moral judgment as much as a medical concern, reinforcing social norms and hierarchies. Religious authorities wielded enormous power, determining who was insane, possessed, or morally corrupted, and what treatment, often painful and frightening, was necessary. Women were especially vulnerable to accusations of demonic possession. Historical records reveal that women displaying emotional distress, hysteria, or behavioral oddities were disproportionately labeled as possessed. This was compounded by misogynistic beliefs about female nature. Women were thought to be weaker, more emotional, and more susceptible to temptation by evil forces. Ordinary symptoms of sadness, anxiety, or anger could be reinterpreted as proof that a woman was under satanic influence. Trials, exorcisms, or confinement often followed. Fear amplified the power of the demon myth. Medieval society lived in constant proximity to death, disease, famine, and war. Stress, grief, and trauma were everyday realities. In such a world, supernatural explanations were comforting. They provided reason and structure. If your mind was suffering, it was not random chaos, it was the deliberate interference of an external, intelligible force. This gave people a way to understand, predict, and attempt to control the uncontrollable. the four humors theory intersected with demonology in complex ways. An imbalance of black bile might predispose someone to melancholy, excessive yellow bile could cause rage. But when these conditions appeared extreme or inexplicable, they were often interpreted as demonic influence. Physical treatments like bloodletting or purges were combined with spiritual interventions, creating a system where the body and soul were simultaneously corrected. Education, wealth, and social status offered some protection. A wealthy noble experiencing symptoms of anxiety or mania might receive careful spiritual guidance and be discreetly treated at home. A poor peasant with similar symptoms was more likely to be publicly exorcised, humiliated, or imprisoned. The belief in demonic possession thus reinforced social inequality, making the poor and powerless more vulnerable to harsh interventions. Even the Church admitted that diagnosis was difficult. Determining whether someone was truly possessed or simply ill required intense scrutiny, moral evaluation, and ritual testing. Clerics often relied on confessions, behavior, and perceived signs, crying, screaming, resisting authority, or blaspheming, to decide. This made the process highly subjective, allowing prejudice, fear, and superstition to dominate. Despite its brutality, the demon-centered view of the mind had cultural power. It explained the unexplainable, provided moral lessons, and reinforced the authority of religious institutions. It also shaped the way society understood suffering. Mental distress was a test, a warning, or a punishment. It was never random, meaningless, or purely physical. The consequences of this worldview were profound. Individuals experiencing mental illness often suffered twice. First from the symptoms themselves, and second from fear, stigma, and invasive interventions justified by belief in demonic influence. Families were often complicit, terrified of social judgment and divine retribution. Communities ostracized, punished, or persecuted those labeled as possessed, perpetuating a cycle of fear and suffering. Chapter 5 demonstrates a critical theme of medieval psychology: the human mind was rarely approached with curiosity or empathy. Instead, behavior was interpreted through a moral and spiritual lens, often resulting in harsh treatment, public shame, and trauma. What modern psychology seeks to understand and treat, medieval society often sought to judge, punish, or exorcise. Ultimately, the belief in demons as controllers of the mind reflected both ignorance and human desire for order. In a world filled with uncertainty, chaos, and suffering, supernatural explanations offered structure and meaning. They made mental illness something visible, explainable, and controllable, even if that control was brutal and misguided. And yet, as terrifying as the demon myth was, it also reminds us how culture shapes psychology. Human suffering cannot exist outside interpretation. Societies always attempt to explain, judge, or correct what they fear. In the medieval mind, demons were real. The soul was fragile, and the human mind was never neutral. In the medieval world, the female body and mind were shrouded in mystery, fear, and misinformation. While men's mental health was often explained through the four humors or divine influence, women were subjected to uniquely gendered myths. Among the most pervasive was the concept of hysteria, a diagnosis reserved almost exclusively for women, rooted in the belief that the uterus, or womb, was the source of mental and emotional instability. Medieval society believed that the female mind could not be understood independently of the female body, and this assumption led to centuries of misunderstanding, oppression, and suffering. The term, hysteria, itself comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Ancient Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, theorized that a woman's womb could move within her body, causing physical and psychological disturbances. This idea was later adopted and expanded in medieval Europe. According to the theory, a womb that wandered from its proper position could press on nerves, organs, or the brain itself, producing symptoms such as anxiety, fainting, irritability, sexual desire, sadness, or even fits of rage. This wandering womb theory made women's emotions seem inherently unstable. Sadness, anger, desire, or nervousness was not interpreted as a reaction to social conditions, trauma, or circumstance. Instead, it was blamed on the physical movements of the uterus. Even intelligence, creativity, and personality were sometimes attributed to the effects of humors interacting with this wandering organ. Women were defined biologically, and their mental health was inseparable from their reproductive organs. Hysteria was treated as a medical problem, but treatments were often bizarre, invasive, and painful. Physicians recommended methods such as genital massages, fumigation, herbal remedies, tight bindings, and even vaginal fumigation with aromatic herbs to coax the womb back into its proper place. Doctors also prescribed bloodletting purges and strict dietary regimens to balance the humors, often ignoring the fact that the root cause was misunderstood. These treatments were largely ineffective, and sometimes dangerous, yet they persisted for centuries, because the underlying belief in the wandering womb remained unchallenged. Religion and morality compounded the problem. Medieval thinkers often interpreted female melancholy, hysteria, or sexual desire as signs of sin, moral weakness, or susceptibility to demonic influence. A woman who expressed anger, lust, or even strong emotion could be accused of inviting evil into her body or mind. Mental suffering in women was rarely met with sympathy. Instead, it was moralized, disciplined, or punished. Religious and social pressure demanded emotional restraint and obedience, reinforcing the notion that women's minds were naturally fragile and their behavior dangerous. Social status and wealth affected how women were treated. Noblewomen might be confined in monasteries or carefully supervised while undergoing complex treatments administered by skilled physicians. Poor women, however, often faced harsher consequences. Emotional or behavioral disturbances could lead to public humiliation, confinement, or accusations of witchcraft. In some cases, women exhibiting hysteria-like symptoms were accused of consorting with demons, bringing together medical myth and religious fear in the most punitive ways. The hysteria myth had profound implications for medieval society. By framing women's minds as unstable and their emotions as inherently suspect, it justified patriarchal control. Husbands, fathers, and male physicians were granted authority to regulate, discipline, and even restrain women. Female voices were devalued. Their complaints of sadness, fatigue, or distress were often dismissed as mere symptoms of hysteria. Women's agency, autonomy, and experiences were systematically undermined. Education and intellectual pursuit were also affected. Women were considered less rational and more prone to bodily interference in their mental processes. This belief limited access to scholarly and philosophical fields. If the mind was dominated by a wandering womb, women were presumed incapable of sustained intellectual work. Yet paradoxically, some highly educated women philosophers, writers, or healers were often branded as hysterical or morally corrupt when they exhibited emotional intensity or ambition. Hysteria was also gendered in its societal interpretation. Male melancholy or anger was sometimes romanticized or excused as a mark of genius or temperament, but female emotional expression was pathologized. Emotional suffering in women was never neutral. It was biologically predetermined, morally suspect, and socially dangerous. Women's feelings were rarely taken at face value. Instead, they were interpreted, judged, and corrected through the lens of superstition and patriarchal authority. Despite its medical framing, hysteria was more than a health issue. It was a cultural tool that reinforced gender hierarchy. It justified physical interventions, moral regulation, and social control. Emotional suffering, sexual desire, or nonconformity were never neutral experiences. They were evidence of a faulty body, faulty morals, or spiritual failure. The wandering womb became both a medical and moral metaphor for female instability, shaping centuries of attitudes toward women's health and psychology. The long-term consequences of these beliefs were devastating. Women internalized the idea that their minds were inherently flawed, that their emotions were dangerous, and that suffering was inevitable. Generations of women endured physical pain, emotional repression, and social stigma, often believing that their distress was their fault. Families, doctors, and religious authorities reinforced this narrative, leaving little room for understanding or genuine care. Chapter 6 exposes the cruel intersection of gender, medicine, and superstition in medieval psychology. While men's minds were subject to theories of humors or divine testing, women were trapped in myths of hysteria and bodily weakness. Emotional suffering was not only misdiagnosed but moralized, reinforcing the belief that women were naturally unstable. The wandering womb myth is a stark reminder of how culture, gender, and fear shape psychological thought, and how misunderstanding can lead to profound suffering. Even today, echoes of these beliefs remain. The idea that women are inherently more emotional, fragile, or irrational persists in subtle ways, shaping societal expectations, medical treatment, and gender roles. Understanding the history of hysteria and the wandering womb illuminates how medieval myths about the mind continue to influence perceptions of gender and mental health centuries later. In medieval Europe, the human mind was not fully understood, but people were desperate to glean why some individuals were brave, melancholic, cunning, or joyful. When religion, humors, and demons were not enough, society turned its gaze to the heavens. Astrology, the study of the stars and planets, was not merely a tool for predicting the weather or planning harvests. It was considered a powerful science capable of determining human behavior, personality, and destiny. The position of the planets at the moment of birth was thought to shape the mind, emotions, and even moral character of every individual. Astrology in the medieval period was deeply intertwined with the dominant medical and psychological theories of the time. Physicians often consulted the stars before diagnosing illness or prescribing treatment, and astrologers frequently acted as psychological counselors, offering guidance on temperament, relationships, and personal conduct. Astrology was considered scientific, moral, and spiritual, a lens through which both body and mind could be understood. The connection between astrology and personality stemmed from the belief in celestial influence. Each planet and star was thought to emit a unique force, which interacted with the humors within the body. Mars might induce aggression, Venus romantic longing, Saturn melancholy, and Jupiter ambition. These planetary forces affected not just physical health, but also mental state and temperament. A person born under the influence of Saturn, for example, might be introspective, melancholic, or prone to anxiety, while someone influenced by Jupiter could be confident, optimistic, and ambitious. Astrology also provided a framework for understanding human variation. In a world where mental illness, emotional instability, and unusual behavior were feared and stigmatized, astrology offered a seemingly rational explanation. If a person acted strangely, it was not necessarily sin, moral weakness, or demonic possession. It could be the alignment of the stars at birth. This explanation gave hope to families, clergy, and physicians, suggesting that mental traits had cosmic origins and might be predicted or moderated through careful observation. Astrological charts, horoscopes, and planetary tables became standard tools for understanding personality. Birth charts mapped the positions of the sun, moon, and planets relative to the time and location of birth. Scholars believed that these charts could predict not only an individual's emotional tendencies, but also intelligence, moral character, and social behavior. A melancholic child born under Saturn might need stricter guidance. A sanguine youth born under the sun might be nurtured for leadership roles. These predictions shaped parenting, education, and social expectations, reinforcing societal hierarchies and moral norms. The integration of astrology into medicine further reinforced its influence. Physicians often timed treatments according to the movement of the stars, believing that surgical procedures, bloodletting, and purges were more effective when planetary forces were favorable. If mental distress was caused or exacerbated by celestial influence, Treatment might include spiritual guidance, herbal remedies, or ritualistic practices synchronized with astrological events. Even the success or failure of treatments was often interpreted through the lens of astrology, creating a self-reinforcing system of belief. Astrology also intersected with gendered assumptions about mental health. Women were considered more susceptible to planetary influence, just as they were believed to be affected by humors or the wandering womb. A woman born under Venus might be labeled overly emotional or seductive. One influenced by the moon could be deemed capricious or melancholic. Male personalities were also interpreted astrologically, but women's traits were more readily pathologized and moralized, reinforcing societal control over female behavior. Astrological psychology extended beyond the individual. Entire nations, rulers, and armies were analyzed in terms of celestial influence. Kings consulted astrologers before battles, councils, and marriages. Political events were interpreted as reflections of planetary alignments, and the mental stability of rulers was linked to cosmic forces. This belief system blurred the line between individual psychology and broader social or political order, suggesting that the health of the mind and society alike depended on the harmonious movement of the heavens. Critically, astrology provided both explanation and justification for social norms and inequalities. People of different temperaments could be assigned roles in society, based on their celestial predispositions. Aggression, melancholy, or timidity were not just personal traits, they were cosmic assignments. Those struggling with mental distress could be seen as naturally limited or morally burdened, legitimizing hierarchical social structures and limiting attempts to question authority or reform treatment practices. Astrology also reinforced medieval notions of fate and predestination, while modern psychology emphasizes agency, environment, and personal responsibility. Medieval astrologers argued that the stars set the framework within which human behavior unfolded. Suffering, intelligence, and temperament were not entirely within one's control. Mental instability, anxiety, or melancholy might be written in the stars, providing a convenient but rigid framework for interpreting human difference. Despite its mystical overtones, astrology was not considered superstition in medieval society. Universities taught it alongside metaphysics and natural philosophy. Clergy, physicians, and scholars relied on astrological reasoning, integrating it seamlessly into religious and medical thought. Its prevalence highlights the ways in which medieval people sought order, explanation, and prediction in a world filled with uncertainty, illness, and fear. Chapter 7 demonstrates a critical theme of medieval psychology: the human mind was never understood in isolation. Instead, it was interpreted through layers of religious, medical, and cosmic influence. Behavior, emotion, and mental health were assigned meaning from the heavens as well as from the body and soul. Astrology exemplifies the medieval desire to explain, categorize, and control the human mind, even when those explanations had no scientific basis. By examining astrology's role in medieval thought, we see how deeply cultural beliefs, celestial speculation, and moral interpretation shape perceptions of personality and mental health. What modern psychology investigates through neuroscience, observation, and therapy, medieval thinkers approached through stars, humors, and divine order. And in this celestial system, the mind was never neutral, it was a reflection of the cosmos, a moral barometer, and a site of constant surveillance and interpretation. In the medieval mind, sleep was not merely a biological necessity. It was a portal to the supernatural, a time when the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds blurred. Dreams were considered powerful, meaningful, and often prophetic. Unlike modern psychology, which interprets dreams as reflections of the subconscious, medieval thinkers believed that dreams were messages from God, angels, or demons, and that understanding them could reveal truths about morality, destiny, and mental health. For people living in a world of uncertainty, illness, and spiritual anxiety, dreams were far more than fleeting images, They were signs to be interpreted, feared, and obeyed. Dream interpretation was an established practice in medieval Europe. Scholars, theologians, and physicians wrote treatises outlining the types of dreams, their meanings, and the methods for decoding them. Some dreams were considered divine warnings or guidance, while others were seen as temptations or tests from the devil. The moral and spiritual framework of the time ensured that no dream could be neutral every vision. Nightmare or fleeting image had moral significance. Dreams from God were often clear, vivid, and accompanied by feelings of awe, peace, or reverence. They were interpreted as instructions, blessings, or prophecies. Kings and nobles reported dreams predicting battles, political outcomes, or natural disasters, and these visions were taken seriously by courts and councils. For ordinary people, dreams could indicate divine approval, the path to virtue, or the need for repentance. A dream of angels, sacred figures, or holy light was understood as a message of guidance and reassurance. On the other hand, dreams from the devil were frightening, chaotic, and disturbing. They were believed to manipulate the mind, sow doubt, and encourage sin. Nightmares, hallucinations, or bizarre visions were often interpreted as demonic attempts to lead the sleeper into error. A vivid dream of committing a crime, blaspheming, or succumbing to lust might be viewed not as a product of imagination, but as a spiritual threat, a warning that the individual's soul was vulnerable. Fear of such dreams could lead to moral anxiety, self-punishment, or excessive religious devotion. Dreams were also linked to mental imbalance and humors. For instance, melancholics were believed to experience dark, disturbing dreams due to the dominance of black bile, which clouded perception and predisposed them to despair. Sanguine individuals might dream of love, pleasure, and social activity, while choleric types could experience violent, aggressive visions. Phlegmatic dreamers were thought to have slow, dull, or confused dreams, reflecting their lethargic temperament. In this way, dreams became both psychological symptom and moral indicator, reinforcing the belief that mental and spiritual health were intertwined. Interpreting dreams required specialized knowledge. Clerics, monks, and scholars often acted as dream interpreters, using religious texts, classical writings, and personal experience to decode visions. Specific symbols carried standard meanings. A snake might indicate sin or treachery, water could signify emotion or danger. Fire represented passion, anger, or divine judgment. These interpretations were applied with moral authority, shaping behavior, decisions, and social judgments. Dreams were also considered predictive of physical and mental health. A recurring nightmare might suggest demonic possession, or impending illness, while pleasant visions could signal spiritual alignment and robust well-being. Physicians sometimes advised patients to record dreams as part of their treatment, believing that the content revealed imbalances in humors or the influence of supernatural forces. A dream could be as diagnostically significant as fever, pallor, or pulse. The fear of dreams could intensify mental distress. People might wake in panic, guilt, or despair, convinced that they had sinned or attracted demonic attention. Sleep itself became dangerous. Anxiety about dreaming, combined with spiritual vigilance, led to insomnia, obsessive prayer, and even physical ailments. The mind, which was already misunderstood, became further entangled in fear, superstition, and moral scrutiny. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to dream-based interpretations. Hysteria, melancholy, or emotional fluctuations were often reinforced through dreams. A woman experiencing erotic or disturbing dreams could be accused of moral weakness. Susceptibility to the devil or spiritual imbalance. Dreams served as another tool for controlling female behavior, linking mental health, morality, and gender in a tight web of surveillance and judgment. Despite these oppressive interpretations, dreams also offered insight, guidance, and hope. People relied on them to make decisions about marriage, travel, business, and moral conduct. Dreams could serve as moral correction. warning individuals of impending danger or guiding them towards spiritual improvement. In a world of uncertainty, dreams were an essential interface between the seen and unseen, the material and divine. Chapter 8 illustrates a central theme of medieval psychology. Every mental phenomenon was laden with meaning, morality, and supernatural significance. Sleep was not rest, it was a battlefield of angels and demons, a mirror of temperament and a moral testing ground. The human mind was never neutral or private. Dreams, like thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, were constantly observed, interpreted, and judged. By understanding the medieval interpretation of dreams, we can see how fear, religion, and superstition shaped perceptions of the mind. Modern psychology recognizes dreams as cognitive processing, emotional reflection, or neural activity. But for medieval thinkers, dreams were sacred and terrifying messages, capable of guiding or condemning the soul. The distinction between mental state, moral conduct, and spiritual destiny was blurred, leaving individuals both responsible and fearful for the contents of their own minds. And in this worldview, to dream was to participate in a cosmic dialogue, one that could bring wisdom, warning, or eternal peril. In the medieval period, the understanding of the human mind extended to all ages, but it was particularly rigid when it came to children. Unlike modern psychology, which emphasizes developmental stages, learning processes, and emotional growth, medieval thinkers often viewed children as miniature adults. Their minds were thought to be fully formed and morally accountable, just on a smaller scale. This perspective profoundly shaped child-rearing practices, education, discipline, and societal expectations, often with harsh consequences. Medieval society did not recognize childhood as a distinct developmental phase. Children were believed to possess the same virtues, vices, and susceptibilities as adults, only in a less potent form. Just as the four humors influenced adult temperament, they were thought to determine the emotional and moral constitution of children. A sanguine child might be cheerful but impulsive. A melancholic child might be thought yet prone to fear. A choleric child might show early signs of aggression. A phlegmatic child might appear calm but lazy. Personality and morality were believed to be largely innate, leaving little room for growth or change. This perspective had significant implications for discipline. Children were expected to adhere to adult moral standards from an early age. Misbehavior was interpreted as either moral weakness, natural imbalance of humors, or even the influence of demons. Parents and teachers employed strict discipline, ranging from verbal reprimands to physical punishment, to correct perceived faults. Corporal punishment was not considered abusive but necessary to train the soul and align the child's behavior with moral and social expectations. Education was similarly influenced by the belief that children were miniature adults. Scholars argued that children should be taught literacy, religious doctrine, and social duties as soon as they could comprehend them. Play was often minimized in favor of instruction, moral exercises, and ritual practice. The underlying assumption was that children's minds were ready for adult reasoning, and delaying education or moral training could allow sin, laziness, or imbalance to take root. Medicine and psychology also intersected with these views. Physicians monitored children for signs of humoral imbalance from infancy. Excess blood could make a child excitable and restless. Too much phlegm could make them slow or dull. Excess yellow bile could provoke anger and aggression. Too much black bile could lead to sadness, fear, or melancholy. Treatments included dietary adjustments, herbal remedies, or gentle bloodletting. While often harmful, these interventions were framed as necessary to ensure both physical and mental health. Religious influence reinforced the notion of children as morally accountable. Baptism, prayer, confession, and early instruction in sin and virtue were central to child rearing. The medieval church taught that even children could fall into temptation or error, and that early moral guidance was essential to secure salvation. The belief that children's souls were inherently susceptible to sin justified strict supervision and spiritual education. Social class and gender shaped how these beliefs played out. Noble children were carefully guided, educated, and supervised to prepare them for leadership roles, while peasant children were often required to work and contribute to families' survival from an early age. Boys were trained for strength, leadership, and public duty. Girls were trained for obedience, domestic skills, and moral propriety. Both were held to adult standards of behavior, leaving little room for genuine childhood freedom or exploration. The consequences of viewing children as miniature adults were far-reaching. Emotional expression, curiosity, and rebellion were often punished rather than nurtured. Play and imagination, recognized today as essential for cognitive and emotional development, were undervalued. Children were expected to internalize moral lessons, control their humors, and maintain proper behavior, often without support or understanding. Anxiety, sadness, or fear was interpreted as personal failure or imbalance, not a normal response to the stresses of growing up. This worldview also reinforced gender norms and societal hierarchies. Girls were disciplined for emotional expression, sexual curiosity, or defiance, while boys were corrected for aggression, disobedience, or excessive ambition. The moral and psychological frameworks applied to children mirrored those applied to adults, perpetuating social expectations and inequality from a very young age. Yet, there were rare exceptions. Some texts and thinkers recognized that children were impressionable and needed guidance, suggesting gentle correction, moral stories, and structured instruction. However, these approaches were overshadowed by the dominant belief that children were small adults whose minds and required strict training to prevent sin, imbalance, or misbehavior. Chapter 9 reveals a critical aspect of medieval psychology. Childhood was not seen as a unique stage of life, but as a preparatory period for adult moral and mental responsibilities. Emotional, cognitive, and social development were undervalued, and children were held to standards they could scarcely meet. Fear of sin, humoral imbalance, and social deviation governed their upbringing, shaping generations of youth to internalize discipline, repression, and moral vigilance. This perception of children as miniature adults underscores the medieval obsession with control over bodies, minds, and souls. Mental health, moral behavior, and social order were inseparable, and children were expected to conform to adult norms without question. The long-term impact of this worldview can still be seen in lingering societal expectations about obedience, emotional restraint, and early accountability in youth, highlighting the enduring influence of medieval psychological thought. In medieval Europe, madness was not understood as a medical condition, nor as a mental health issue. Instead, it was considered a moral, spiritual, and social problem, with severe implications for both the individual and the community. Mental disturbance, whether caused by humoral imbalance, demonic influence, or divine punishment, was feared and mistrusted. Society's response was harsh, blending punishment, containment, and ritual correction, often with little concern for compassion, understanding, or treatment. Chapter 10 explores how medieval society dealt with insanity, revealing a system where fear and control dominated empathy and care. The perception of insanity was deeply tied to morality and religion. Individuals who acted unpredictably, spoke incoherently, or displayed violent or bizarre behavior, were seen as morally corrupt, spiritually endangered, or divinely punished. The notion that the mind was linked to the soul meant that mental disturbance was more than a personal problem. It was a threat to the moral and spiritual order. A mad person was not only suffering but potentially dangerous, both to themselves and to the community. Legal systems reinforced this perspective. Courts often treated insane individuals differently from ordinary criminals, but not necessarily more humanly. Some might be excused from full punishment, if their actions were attributed to madness. Yet they could still face confinement, corporal punishment, or public humiliation. Jails, dungeons, and chained cells were common places for those deemed insane, effectively separating them from society under the guise of protection. In some cases, imprisonment served both to control the individual and to reassure the public that moral order was maintained. Punishment was often intertwined with the idea of moral correction. A person displaying violent or sexually deviant behavior might be beaten, flogged, or restrained to teach them right from wrong. Public shaming was common. People might be paraded through towns in chains or subjected to ridicule to demonstrate that disorder would not be tolerated. Rather than addressing underlying causes, whether humoral imbalance, trauma, or supernatural influence, society focused on reinstating obedience and conformity. Religious institutions played a critical role in enforcing punishment. Monks, priests, and church authorities often acted as both counselors and enforcers, performing exorcisms, penitential rituals, or spiritual interventions on those considered mad. Spiritual correction was sometimes brutal. Individuals might be confined in monasteries, subjected to fasting, whipped, or forced to undergo ritual humiliation. The aim was not comfort or recovery, but realignment of the mind and soul with divine order. The treatment of women was particularly severe. Female madness was frequently interpreted as a combination of hysteria, demonic possession, and moral weakness. Women displaying mental disturbance could be confined in convents, chained at home, or accused of witchcraft. Physical restraint, ritual exorcism, and public shame were common. The gendered dimension of punishment reflected broader societal beliefs about female vulnerability, emotional instability, and moral responsibility. Men, though also punished, were more often seen as victims of humoral imbalance or divine testing, sometimes earning sympathy for their suffering. Medical theory intersected with punishment. Physicians sometimes recommended bloodletting, purging, or herbal remedies alongside confinement and spiritual treatment. The idea was that mental illness had both physical and spiritual components, requiring a combination of interventions. However, treatments were rarely based on observation or evidence, and often exacerbated suffering. In practice, the overlap of punishment, medical intervention, and religious ritual made the experience of madness both terrifying and dehumanizing. Communities also participated in regulating the mad. Fear of violence, unpredictable behavior, or divine contagion led neighbors to ostracize or isolate affected individuals. Those who wandered in public, shouted, or acted eccentrically might be driven out of towns, chained, or locked away, with family compliance often enforced by social pressure. The mad were simultaneously feared, shunned, and surveilled, highlighting how societal order took precedence over care or understanding. Interestingly, there were cases where insanity was romanticized or respected, especially among nobles or intellectuals. Melancholic thinkers, poets, or rulers might have their odd behavior reframed as genius or divine insight. Yet this was the exception rather than the rule. For most, madness meant suffering, marginalization, and punishment, rather than respect or support. Chapter 10 highlights the medieval belief that insanity was both a personal affliction and a social threat. It was interpreted as a moral failing, a spiritual test, or a danger to the community. Treatment and punishment were intertwined, often indistinguishable. Empathy, scientific reasoning, or psychological support was rare, replaced by control, ritual, and discipline. The mad were both subjects of fear and instruments for enforcing social order. This approach reveals a broader truth about medieval psychology. The mind was never considered neutral or private. Behavior, emotion, and thought were subject to moral, spiritual, and social judgment. Those who deviated from accepted norms, whether due to humoral imbalance, divine punishment, or supernatural interference, were punished in ways designed to restore both their own alignment and the community's moral and social stability. Ultimately, medieval society's response to insanity was a mix of fear, control, and moral correction, with little concern for comfort or understanding. Chapter 10 illustrates how culture, religion, and superstition shape treatment of mental illness, leaving a legacy of stigma and harsh interventions that would persist for centuries. In the medieval period, understanding the human mind was inseparable from understanding the body and the divine. When it came to treating madness, society relied on a combination of medical theory, religious belief, and superstition. The goal was not just to heal, but to restore moral, spiritual, and humoral balance. Chapter 11 explores the various treatments medieval people employed for mental disturbance, highlighting a world where the line between medicine, ritual, and punishment was often blurred. The foundation of medieval medical practice was the theory of the four humors. Physicians believed that the mind and body were governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance in these humors could produce both physical and mental illness. Madness in this framework was caused by extreme imbalance. Excess black bile could lead to melancholy, yellow bile to anger, and so on. Consequently, treatments often focused on removing or rebalancing humors, regardless of whether the methods were painful or dangerous. Bloodletting was one of the most common practices. By draining blood from veins, leeches, or incisions, physicians aimed to reduce excess humors and restore equilibrium. Bloodletting was used for a wide range of mental disturbances: sudden rage, melancholic despair, and even demonic possession. While the logic was consistent with humoral theory, the practice often weakened patients physically, exacerbating symptoms rather than alleviating them. In extreme cases, excessive bloodletting led to permanent injury or death, yet it persisted because it aligned with the accepted understanding of body and mind. Purging was another staple of treatment. Physicians prescribed emetics, laxatives, or enemas to expel excess bile or other harmful substances from the body. The belief was that clearing the body of internal toxins would also clear the mind of imbalance, restoring reason and emotional stability. Purges were rigorous and repeated, sometimes leaving patients dehydrated, malnourished, and further mentally distressed. Yet, they were widely accepted, illustrating how medieval medicine conflated physical and psychological suffering. Dietary regulation was also central to treatment. Foods were categorized according to their humoral qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, light, heavy. Melancholic patients were often given warming foods, such as meats and spices, to counteract cold and dry black bile. Choleric individuals received cooling, soothing foods to temper heat and aggression. These interventions were subtle compared to bloodletting or purges, but they reinforced the belief that mind and body were interconnected. Religious rituals were equally important in the treatment of mental disturbance. Madness was often interpreted as a moral or spiritual problem, and medical interventions were supplemented with spiritual remedies. Prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and confession were prescribed to cleanse the soul. Exorcisms were common when symptoms suggested demonic possession, especially in cases of hallucinations, convulsions, or violent behavior. Religious authority and medical authority were not separate. In fact, the Church often guided medical practice. The goal was both healing and moral realignment. Physical restraints were also used, often justified as part of treatment. Chains, cages, or confinement prevented self-harm, public disruption, or escape during exorcisms or purges. While some restraints may have protected the patient, they also served as social control, reinforcing the notion that the mad were dangerous and in need of discipline. Family members frequently assisted, believing they were fulfilling moral and spiritual duties. Some treatments were highly experimental or extreme. Fumigation of the body or genitals with herbal smoke was believed to expel evil or rebalance humors. Cold baths, heat therapies, and enforced isolation were prescribed depending on the nature of the perceived imbalance. These methods were inconsistent, guided by individual physicians' experience, local customs, and prevailing superstitions. Their common denominator was the belief that madness was both bodily and spiritual, requiring interventions in both realms. Treatment was also stratified by social class. Nobles received more careful, resource-intensive care, private rooms, personal physicians, and spiritual advisors. Peasants and lower-class individuals were often subjected to harsher, public or more ritualistic interventions. Their suffering was visible and communal, reflecting social hierarchies as well as medical beliefs. Women were particularly vulnerable, with hysteria, melancholy, or suspected possession often resulting in confinement, exorcism, and invasive physical treatments. Despite their harshness, these methods reflected the medieval desire to impose order on the chaotic mind. Pain, discipline, and ritual were believed to restore moral, spiritual, and humoral equilibrium. Suffering was reframed as meaningful, either as a moral lesson, a path to divine favor, or a corrective process. Success was interpreted as proof of cosmic and humoral alignment. Failure was often blamed on the patient's sin, weakness, or spiritual corruption. Chapter 11 demonstrates that medieval treatment of madness was not purely medical, nor purely punitive, but a combination of both. Bloodletting, purges, dietary regulation, religious ritual, and physical restraint were interwoven into a complex system that reflected the society's understanding of the mind. Compassion was secondary to correction, and comfort was rarely a priority. Patients were treated as bodies and souls to be realigned, rather than humans to be understood. The long-term consequences of these methods were profound. Physical suffering, social stigma, and moral condemnation often worsened mental distress. Misunderstanding and fear dominated care, leaving patients trapped in cycles of treatment, punishment, and isolation. Yet, these practices reveal a consistent theme in medieval psychology: every symptom, every behavior, every mental disturbance had meaning, and that meaning dictated intervention. Ultimately, Chapter 11 highlights how deeply medieval medicine, religion, and superstition were entangled. Madness was not simply illness, it was a moral, spiritual, and bodily disorder. Treatment, therefore, was holistic in intention but harsh, misguided, and often brutal in practice. Bloodletting, purges, rituals, and confinement shaped the medieval mind's understanding of itself, leaving a legacy of fear, stigma, and control that would echo for centuries. In medieval Europe, stories, myths, and folklore were not just entertainment, they were powerful instruments for understanding the human mind. Literature and oral tradition reflected and reinforced society's beliefs about morality, mental health, and the supernatural. Madness, in particular, was a central theme, appearing in religious texts, romances, ballads, and legends. Through these narratives, the medieval imagination explored the boundaries of reason and irrationality, morality and sin, the human and the divine. Chapter 12 examines how literature and folklore both depicted and shaped perceptions of mental disturbance. Madness often served as a moral lesson in medieval stories. Characters who strayed from virtue, acted with hubris, or engaged in sinful behavior frequently descended into madness, symbolizing the consequences of moral failure. A nobleman who betrayed his king might go mad. Wandering forests and speaking in riddles, a woman who defied social or religious norms might become melancholic, obsessed, or possessed. Literature reflected the belief that the mind mirrored moral and spiritual order. Madness was rarely random, it was the visible, dramatic proof of cosmic or divine justice. Religious literature reinforced this idea. Saints' lives, hagiographies, and biblical retellings depicted madness as both punishment and revelation. Characters might lose reason as a result of sin, yet through suffering regain wisdom, humility, or spiritual insight. A visionary experience, for instance, could appear as madness to ordinary observers, but be interpreted as divine communication. This dual interpretation reinforced the societal perception that madness could be both terrifying and instructive, a sign of moral failing and spiritual elevation simultaneously. Folklore and ballads often portrayed madness in vivid symbolic ways. Tales of haunted forests, cursed individuals, and spirits influencing the mind populated oral tradition. Villagers might be led astray by fairies, elves, or malicious spirits. Their mad behavior explained by supernatural interference rather than biology. Nightmares, withering, or erratic behavior were common motifs, teaching communities about the dangers of temptation, disobedience, or moral lapse. Such stories reinforced social norms, warning listeners that transgression could have severe, even supernatural, consequences. Romances and courtly literature also explored madness, often linking it to love and desire. A knight spurned by his lady might descend into melancholy, neglecting duties and wandering in sorrow. Similarly, tales of unrequited or forbidden love frequently depicted women as hysteria-stricken, wandering the woods or performing strange rituals in emotional turmoil. These narratives reflected cultural anxieties about passion, desire, and emotional excess, portraying madness as a consequence of unbalanced feelings. Through such stories, emotional disturbance was moralized, gendered, and socially instructive. Trickster figures and fools were another literary device through which madness was explored. Court jesters, wandering beggars, and eccentric characters often displayed behavior considered insane by societal standards. Yet they could speak truths or reveal hidden wisdom. In these cases, madness became a lens for social critique, showing that what society labeled irrational or dangerous could sometimes carry insight. Such portrayals complicated the simplistic view of madness as purely punishment or demonic influence, suggesting that social perception, rather than intrinsic moral failure, could define the mad. Literature also intersected with medical and spiritual beliefs. Humoral imbalance, demonic possession, divine punishment, and celestial influence appeared frequently as explanations for characters' odd behavior. A melancholic prince, a hysterical maiden, or a possessed villager might be described in terms that reflected contemporary medical or religious theory. Readers and listeners were exposed to a blend of entertainment, instruction, and cultural ideology, internalizing the idea that the mind, body, and soul were inseparable and morally charged. Women's madness was a particular focus in literature and folklore. Female characters often embodied fears about sexuality, autonomy, and emotion. Stories depicted them wandering in grief, responding violently to passion, or exhibiting hysteria-like symptoms. Male audiences and storytellers interpreted these behaviors through the lens of moral and physical weakness, reinforcing societal control over women. Folklore became a vehicle for perpetuating ideas about gendered vulnerability, emotional instability, and social expectation. Religious plays and morality tales reinforced the didactic function of madness. Characters might be punished with irrationality for pride, greed, or sin, only to achieve redemption through repentance and virtue. These narratives were not purely allegorical, they reflected and reinforced societal expectations. People were encouraged to see mental disturbance as a moral and spiritual signal, shaping attitudes toward real individuals who experienced similar symptoms. Chapter 12 shows that literature and folklore did more than reflect beliefs, they actively shaped social understanding of mental health. By portraying madness as morally, spiritually, and socially meaningful, stories provided a framework for interpreting behavior, guiding intervention, and regulating society. They taught lessons about obedience, caution, gender norms, and spiritual vigilance, ensuring that the perception of the mind remained intertwined with morality and social order. Through medieval stories, madness was visible, explainable, and socially instructive. It was a dramatic manifestation of the human struggle with desire, sin, and the divine. By reading or listening to these tales, people absorbed lessons about morality, caution, and control, internalizing a worldview in which the mind was never neutral. The soul was always observed, and mental disturbance demanded interpretation and response. Ultimately, Chapter 12 illustrates that medieval psychology was not only a matter of medical theory or religious belief, it was a cultural phenomenon. Literature and folklore made the invisible workings of the mind concrete, moralized, and teachable, leaving an enduring imprint on society's understanding of madness, morality, and human nature. In medieval Europe, the treatment of mental disturbance was a strange amalgamation of medical theory, superstition, and folk practice. While physicians employed humoral theory and religious authorities prescribed prayer and ritual, ordinary people often relied on alcohol, herbs, and folk remedies to manage the mind. These treatments reveal the creative, if often attempts to cope with anxiety, melancholy, hysteria, and other mental states before the advent of modern psychology and medicine. Chapter 13 explores the substances and remedies used to influence the mind, and how they shaped medieval perceptions of mental health. Alcohol was one of the most common methods for affecting mood and behavior. Wine, beer, and distilled spirits were widely available, and their effects on the mind were both celebrated and feared. Alcohol could calm nervousness, provide courage, or relieve sadness, but excessive consumption was linked to aggression, madness, and moral failure. Physicians sometimes recommended wine in controlled doses to balance humors, particularly to warm melancholic patients or soothe choleric tempers. Drinking was both medicinal and recreational, blurring the line between therapy and indulgence. Herbal remedies were central to medieval folk medicine. Plants like valerian, sage, rosemary, and chamomile were believed to soothe the mind, calm nerves, and alleviate melancholy. Recipes often combined herbs with alcohol or honey to increase potency or palatability. Some herbs were considered protective against demonic influence, aligning with religious beliefs about spiritual and mental health. Others were administered to induce sleep, enhance courage, or reduce fear, reflecting the understanding that the mind was influenced by both physical and spiritual forces. Psychoactive substances also found a place in medieval treatment. Mandrake root, henbane, and belladonna were used cautiously for their sedative or hallucinogenic properties. These substances could calm agitation, induce sleep, or provoke visions, but they were highly toxic in the wrong dose. Their use demonstrates the experimental nature of medieval medicine. Trial and error, combined with superstition and observation, guided treatment. The line between cure and poisoning was thin, highlighting both ingenuity and risk. Folk remedies often incorporated ritual and symbolism. Amulets, charms, and prayers were applied to the body or ingested with herbal mixtures to enhance efficacy. A sprig of rosemary tied to the wrist, a sachet of herbs under the pillow, or a cup of specially prepared wine, could all serve as psychological support, providing comfort through belief as much as chemical action. Mental health, in this worldview, was inseparable from faith and ritual. The placebo effect was unintentionally recognized centuries before it was scientifically described. Alcohol and herbal remedies were also gendered in their application. Women were often given sedative herbs to calm hysteria or emotional outbursts, while men might receive stimulating concoctions to bolster courage or temper melancholic introspection. Mothers, midwives, and older women often acted as community healers, administering remedies passed down through generations. These practices were as much cultural as medical, reflecting communal knowledge about the body, mind, and acceptable behavior. Folk remedies were not limited to ingestion or topical application. Baths infused with herbs, scented oils, and flower petals were believed to restore both bodily and mental balance. Aromatherapy, like practices using rosemary, lavender, or mint, soothed nerves and provided relief from anxiety or melancholy. Hot or cold compresses, steam, and fomentations were employed to remove harmful humors or alleviate agitation. These interventions reveal a holistic understanding of mind and body. Even if the scientific basis was lacking, fear, superstition, and religion influenced the use of these remedies. Some treatments were designed to ward off evil spirits or curses believed to cause mental illness. Water blessed by priests, herbs consecrated during holy days, or ritualistic preparation of a tincture were believed to protect against supernatural causes of madness. The overlap of folk medicine, religion, and superstition shows that medieval people approached mental health through multiple interconnected frameworks, combining physical, spiritual, and symbolic elements. Despite the creativity of these methods, outcomes were highly variable. Some remedies had mild beneficial effects, often due to sedation, placebo, or caloric intake. Others were dangerous, causing poisoning, hallucinations, or physical harm. Yet, they persisted because they aligned with cultural expectations of intervention, and provided a sense of agency in a world dominated by fear of madness, sin, and the unknown. Chapter 13 illustrates that medieval pharmacy, for the mind was both practical and imaginative. Alcohol, herbs and folk remedies served multiple purposes, balancing humors, calming the spirit, preventing demonic influence, and offering emotional comfort. These treatments reflect the understanding that mental health was complex, interconnected, and inseparable from daily life, belief, and community knowledge. By examining these practices, we see how medieval people tried to make sense of mental suffering in an era without modern science. Alcohol and herbal concoctions were not merely substances. They were symbols of care, faith, and the desire to restore order to a chaotic mind. They reveal a society attempting to navigate the fragile boundaries between reason, emotion, and superstition, laying the groundwork for the gradual emergence of more systematic psychology in later centuries. In medieval Europe, society's response to mental disturbance often prioritized containment over care. Those deemed mad, unstable, or dangerously irrational were frequently isolated from the community to prevent harm, maintain social order, and protect both the individual and others. This practice laid the groundwork for what would eventually become asylums, but in the medieval context, isolation was often harsh, punitive, and deeply stigmatizing. Chapter 14 explores how confinement shaped perceptions of mental health, and reflects the societal fear and control that dominated medieval psychology. Isolation took many forms. Families might confine a mentally disturbed member at home, chaining them in a room or attaching them to beds to prevent wandering and self-harm. Monasteries and convents sometimes acted as de facto asylums, particularly for women, where nuns or monks supervised patients in controlled environments. In towns and villages, public spaces like pillories or stocks could be used to display madness as a warning, combining containment with public shaming. The goal was both protection and moral correction. The rationale for confinement was multi-layered. On one hand, it was practical. A person exhibiting violent, erratic, or incomprehensible behavior could endanger themselves or others. On the other hand, confinement was moral and symbolic. Isolation reinforced the idea that madness was dangerous, shameful, and morally significant. To be mad was to occupy a liminal space between order and chaos, reason and sin. The physical act of confinement mirrored the societal desire to regulate not just bodies but minds and souls. Early asylums were rudimentary, often blending religious and medical functions. Monastic institutions occasionally accepted individuals who were mentally disturbed, providing food, shelter, and supervision while emphasizing spiritual discipline. Treatments included prayer, fasting, ritual, and simple medicinal interventions. Though intended to offer refuge, these facilities were strict, regimented, and isolating. Patients were often cut off from family, community, and social life, reinforcing the notion that mental disturbance necessitated separation from normal society. Gender-influenced confinement practices. Women, particularly those thought to be hysterical, possessed, or morally wayward, were disproportionately confined in convents, private rooms, or chained beds. Their behavior, anger, desire, or emotional volatility, was often interpreted as both dangerous and sinful, justifying stricter containment. Men were also confined when violent or erratic. But social and cultural perceptions of masculinity sometimes mitigated the harshness of isolation, framing male mental disturbance as temporary, humoral imbalance, or spiritual trial. Confinement was not only physical but also social. Communities often ostracized individuals deemed mad, cutting them off from employment, marriage, or religious participation. Public shaming, parading patients, exposing them to ridicule, or recording their behavior in town chronicles, reinforced societal boundaries. Madness became a spectacle, a moral lesson for others, and a justification for control. The mind was never seen as private, it was always monitored, interpreted, and regulated. Isolation was sometimes justified as a therapeutic intervention. Physicians and clergy believed that removing patients from stimuli, stress, or morally corrupting influences could restore balance. Quiet rooms, seclusion, and regimented routines were thought to calm agitation, regulate humors, and encourage reflection. Yet, in practice, such isolation often exacerbated suffering, creating loneliness, fear, and anxiety that reinforced the very conditions it sought to alleviate. The medieval fear of the mind's instability also drove the establishment of early public asylums in urban centers. These institutions were intended to segregate the mad from society while maintaining social order. Conditions were harsh, cells were small, sparsely furnished, and often chained. Care was minimal, focusing on feeding and containment rather than treatment or comfort. Patients were subjected to a mixture of medical intervention, religious ritual, and moral correction, reflecting the era's belief that madness was both a bodily and spiritual disorder. Confinement also reflected broader social hierarchies. Nobles and wealthy individuals could secure more comfortable isolation, often in private quarters with personal attendants. Poorer citizens were confined in public or institutional spaces, their suffering visible and communal. Class, wealth, and gender determined both the severity of confinement and the access to treatment, illustrating that medieval psychology was inseparable from social structure and control. Chapter 14 underscores that isolation and confinement were central tools in regulating the mind. They were simultaneously practical, moral, and symbolic, reflecting societal anxiety about disorder, danger, and deviation. The act of containment communicated a clear message. Madness was a threat to both the individual and the community, requiring strict oversight and control. Physical seclusion mirrored the mental, social, and spiritual marginalization experienced by those deemed mad. The legacy of medieval confinement persists in subtle ways. Modern mental health institutions evolved from these early practices, yet the historical association between mental illness and segregation, supervision, and stigma remains influential. Understanding the medieval approach to isolation illuminates the origins of social attitudes toward the mind, revealing a system where fear, control, moral judgment dominated over compassion, understanding.